Everyone, good afternoon and good evening to all of you. I'm joining from Spain, where here it's 10 a.m. Before we begin with the session, I would like to warmly welcome everyone to this session of the Open Data Charter Implementation Working Group. My name is Daiana Bouzo. I'm a member of the Steering Committee of the Implementation Working Group. I also work as independent consultant on transparency, integrity, and gender equality. We encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and organization if you want. And a gentle reminder to please save all your questions for the end of the session once our speakers have presented. Well, today's session explores the relationship between open data and anti-corruption, focusing on how data can move from transparency in principle to accountability in practice. We want to look beyond the idea that more data equals more transparency and discuss with you what makes data truly useful for preventing, detecting, and reducing corruption. To explore these questions, we are joined by three excellent speakers with complementary perspectives. We will discuss with them about beneficial ownership transparency, data-driven integrity tools and accountability initiatives, and broader challenges related to data quality, accessibility, use, and also the gendered dimensions of corruption. Throughout the session, the idea is to look at concrete examples, lessons learned, and what determines whether open data actually leads to impact in practice. So we hope this conversation will help us better understand both the opportunities and the limitations of open data as an anti-corruption tool and identify practical lessons for future policy and practice. As always, the Implementation Working Group aims to provide a collaborative and informal space for learning and exchange among practitioners working on open data and open government. So our goal is that everyone leaves this session with new ideas, with new insights or connections. Well, we have a great group of speakers today who will share their perspective on this topic. I will introduce them. We have Julie Rialet, Policy and Research Manager from Open Ownership. We also have Roberto Roca, Data-Driven Research Specialist at Transparency International. And also we have Michele Coleman. Michele is a doctoral researcher at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and chair of the Gender and Data Taskforce under the Global Civil Society Coalition for the UNCAC's Gender Inclusion and Corruption Working Group. So thank you very much for everyone who is joining, and also thank you to our speakers for being here. And I think that we can begin with the session. I don't know, Julie, if you want to start.
Sure, happy to, Diana. So much. And good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. Thanks, Open Data Charter, for having me as a speaker. I am just going to share my screen if I manage to. Should be able to see slideshow. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So today I am going to talk about beneficial ownership transparency. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the concept, but just in case some people are not, and also for people listening to the recording, just going to start with a quick reminder of the concept. So when talking about beneficial ownership transparency, we're talking about transparency over who ultimately owns, controls, and benefit from legal vehicles, so companies, trusts, and other forms of legal vehicles and arrangements. And so at Open Ownership, we're a global center of expertise on this topic, and we've helped around I think over 35 countries to advance their beneficial ownership transparency BOT reforms since 2017. And so in terms of the concept, those two, legal ownership and beneficial ownership, tends to be sometimes a bit confused, and it's very normal because they are distinct, but they do overlap sometimes. And so just a quick reminder to invite us to look at this first row when you see person A on the diagram, sorry, and company C, to say that both companies and individuals can own companies directly or indirectly. But at the top of the chain, we always have people, natural persons, who are the beneficial owners. And basically, having this information really allows us to gain a more complete picture of corporate structures and help identify the individuals who are involved. And that's pretty important because when this information is obscured, well, it facilitates illicit activities and impedes investigations, including on corruption. So the good news with that is that there are more BO registers and more beneficial ownership information available ever than before, as you can see on the map with um, a sort of overview of existing registers as different steps in their development. But at the same time, despite those progress, we still too often have information that is missing, sometimes that is inaccessible in some places, or that can be very, very hard to use. So that in many places it means there are like really great obstacles to data access, but also data use. So that's what I want to focus on today mainly, and talk about some of the like two reasons that contribute to this. Um, and the first one being some of the tensions that I'm sure everyone heard about between the question of transparency and the question of privacy, data protection. So there has been a lot of debates nationally, internationally, on access to biodata, on how to strike that balance between transparency and privacy, and really design some access regimes that can resist some legal challenges. I'm sure that some of you may have heard of some of the legal challenges that came up in the European context, for example, which led a lot of beneficial ownership registers to go from publicly accessible to more restricted access. So it's how we can strike this balance to have systems that are more sustainable in time and can resist those challenges. And also, how can we strengthen the connection between policymakers, lawmakers, and the people who are actually using this data in the end? Is something that we have seen in our work supporting those reforms in different countries, that there is often a disconnect between those two constituency, which means that the reforms then cannot really be guided by an understanding of how the users require accessing and processing this data. So at Open Ownership, we've worked on there are two pieces of work that I wanted to draw on today mainly. And the first one is a policy briefing that tackles exactly this first bullet from the last slide, on how can you design user-centered and responsible approaches to access regimes to beneficial ownership information. And the second one on the right side of the screen and I'm sure OTC team, you can share links maybe after the presentation, um, is a was based on the first piece of research that we carried out with around 40 data users across different countries in the world. So involving law enforcement, financial intelligence units, civil society organizations, banks, but also private sector providers, a wide range of data users, really. Um, and we've tried to identify some trends in what are some of the common needs that are coming up for these people, and what can be the implication in terms of the types of data that they need access to, and therefore in terms of the systems that are going to be designed to access this information. So just moving to what we have learned from this so far, one thing we've noticed is that there might be some benefit to in reframing the narrative around biodata access. And we've seen with those debates around privacy and transparency that there has been a lot of focus on the question of who should have access to biodata, and perhaps not enough on those additional questions, namely who can not only access biodata, but really who can advance policy goals, because that will drive a lot of the decisions in terms of design of those access regimes. How do they need to use this information to do what? And what does this imply in terms of legal access frameworks and design of information systems? Um, so some of the common needs that we've seen across biodata users um, can be broadly grouped into those four buckets. So I'm just going to quickly run through this. What we've seen is that people generally need a minimum level of accuracy of the data so that they can draw conclusion with some confidence, very strongly direct and timely access to this data, usable data, up-to-date data, and also access to historical information, if possible, also including some information on foreign legal vehicles and individuals, because obviously we've seen that for a lot of illicit activities, including for corruption, a lot of those networks are cross-border. So that's one of the big challenges that I think the field is still grappling with at the moment. Ways to easily retrieve and flexibly search and process the information, including for more advanced analysis, is something that was shared at least with a big part of those users. And also, as I was talking about networks, a way to understand when you're trying to build a picture of those networks, and that's an important point to emphasize when it comes to bio information that is never really used in silo, right? So biodata user use bioregisters, but they use other types of data and need to understand whether the records that they find about individuals, legal entities within the same database, but also across different information sources, refer to the same person or to different subjects. So we talk about entity resolution to try and better understand those relationships. And so from these common needs, we've tried to translate this into what it could mean for the actual data that can be accessed when it can be. And so we've tried to define then what usable data features could mean, and it came up with this sort of summary that usable data would be data that is easy enough to access, interpret, connect, and rely on. And as you can see on the screen, we've tried to map out a number of key features that are pretty likely, if taken all together, to meet quite a lot of those user needs. And so, in terms of you have the scope and the content sort of family of features which relate to what data can be accessed. And the delivery and search features, which relate more to how data can be accessed and processed. And the idea is really to, with those user needs and data usability in mind, to ensure that lawmakers, policymakers then can design access provisions that don't create any major obstacles to effective data use. If I can maybe just take one example, because I'm not going to run through all of these, but just looking at the search area where you have, for example, search by beneficial owner name and ID is something that we've seen is not so widespread in as a feature in existing BO register and has been creating some obstacles for data users. I'm just thinking of for example, public procurement authorities and extractive sector regulators who we've worked with, and when they, for example, are reviewing beneficial ownership information to try and prevent conflicts of interest, potential involvement in corruption, anti-competitive behaviors, etc., when companies are applying to licenses, contracts, tenders. Um, well, sometimes it's very useful to try and understand whether an applicant company and their beneficial owners might they be related to other companies that maybe have a background of involvement in corruption or just non-compliance with legal or regulatory obligations. And so to be able to do that, you start with knowing a person, a beneficial owner of one company, and you would then go to a beneficial ownership register and trying to look for that person, see if there are any connections with other companies. But obviously, if you don't have a means to search the database by the beneficial owner's name, well, you're not going to be able to do this. So it's just a quick example to illustrate this. Um, and so, I mean, just to finish, you might wonder maybe do all those features apply to maybe just publicly accessible data? Is it only for some users? And I would say the answer is like more nuanced and to some extent applying to both to various levels. What we argue in our access briefing is that providing public access to information remains by far the easiest way to ensure that a lot of those needs of users are that a broad range of users can access this data. But in practice, we've seen that public access does not necessarily equals, as per your introduction, Diana, it does not necessarily equals user access to usable data. So that's why in the access briefing we've been talking a lot about the notion of layers. And really trying to emphasize that implementers can implement a layer of publicly accessible data, but that does not preclude them from designing additional layers that are dedicated for specific user groups that have more extensive sets of needs. So basically trying to summarize parts of our briefing, access briefing on one slide, but really inviting people to go and have a look at the briefing after the session. The idea is really to start from clarifying the policy purpose and root everything in this, reviewing some of the legal frameworks, ensuring that provisions in terms of any data protection, anything is sort of clear, and do user research to really understand those needs and tailor the access regime and the systems to those user groups. But essentially, you will recognize on the left side of that slide the scope, content, delivery, search, usability features that I was talking through earlier should be broadly, accessible from all layers of access. And the more, extensive you might go, then the implementers can think of a number of provisions to balance those measures and ensure that this, necessary features can also be proportional to the general interest that they're trying to strike. So again, much to say. I think I might already be over time, but just to cite a few, safeguards that can be put in place. For example, ensuring that users have access to and commit to respecting some very clear terms of use to prevent any data misuse. Ensuring that there are authentication permission in some conditions, while still allowing some public portal access for more basic access um, to be guaranteed for a number of users. So I'm just going to stop here to and welcome any question. But yeah, just in summary, I think some of the key messages of those research would be really to place the concept of usability, responsibility, and sustainability as well at the center of those design of access regimes, so that it can be both, I would say, privacy sensitive and also impactful. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Julie, for your presentation. We can go to the second speaker, and at the end, we probably have a lot of questions for you. But well, let's continue. Roberto, if you want to present.
Thank you very much, Daiana. Allow me also to share my screen, and please do let me know when you can, if you can properly see it. Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you. So today, in my intervention, I will talk about Integrity Watch platforms. So I will, of course, explain very briefly what these platforms are, what they do, and just use them to illustrate how political integrity data can support public accountability. And we will briefly go over on how, let's say, the insights from these platforms can inform political integrity reform and open data governance. So let's get to it. So, well, Integrity Watch platforms, for those who are not familiar with them, it's basically a family of civic monitoring platforms that are developed across the Transparency International movement. As of now, includes more than 20 country-level platforms, mainly in Europe, alongside some tools that are operating at the EU level. No, so together these platforms bring more than 70 data sets covering diverse areas such as lobbying, public procurement, political finance, assets and interest declaration, beneficial ownership, and other political integrity issues. Now, they are, let's say, in this sense, comprehensive as a whole, let's say, but of course, each country specific platform differs, no, on what it showcases. Basically, in each country, the platform reflects the country's own political integrity context, no? Of course, their thematic focus is guided by the local advocacy priorities. And of course, their practical scope is shaped by the availability and the quality of public data. Now, these platforms seek to present information through searchable tables, filters, summary statistics, visualization, explanatory text, etc., all with the aim of making them, let's say, as user-friendly as possible. No, so the idea is just try to help citizens, journalists, civil society, researchers, and policymakers access and explore this information that would otherwise be, let's say, fragmented across different registers from different public institutions. Now, for example, let's just take the example of the EU Integrity Watch platform. It provides interactive data on European Commission and European Parliament lobbying meetings, data on EU lobbyists and members of the European Parliament side incomes. Now, this EU platform alone reaches more than 20,000 visitors each year, but more importantly, I would say it had served to support media reporting, academic research, and civil society engagement. Now, it's important to, let's say, keep in mind, it makes things quite obvious, but also very worth mentioning, I would say, is that, of course, as we mentioned, data, it's an enabler. No? So these platforms are also are not an end in themselves. They are a tool. No, their value lies in helping, let's say, organize the information, the data around, let's call it, clear accountability questions. No, so for example, lobbying data can help us examine who gets access to the decision makers and whether those contacts are properly disclosed. Political fairness data can show who funds political parties and candidates, and whether these patterns and whether there are patterns that may deserve closer scrutiny. Now, asset income and interest declaration can provide information about, let's say, outside activities or financial interests, no, of public officials that may affect their public duties. And procurement data, of course, can show who received public contracts. But now let's look at it this way. No, let's take, for example, a political donation data set. It, of course, can tell us something on its own. And if we take a procurement data set, it can tell us something on its own. But it's when we establish these connections that we can reveal, let's say, relationships that perhaps would have been harder to see if we have examined each data set separately. No, so the idea in Integrity Watch is that it tries to help turn public information into more focused questions, if we want to put it that way. No. Now, when these different types of data are analyzed together, of course, they can support the development of these political integrity risk indicators, which basically in plain language, no, these are observable patterns or gaps or relationships that may be associated with an increased integrity risk. No, so as we all know, no, these are not proof of wrongdoing. They just help identify where closer scrutiny may be needed. No, so just for illustrative purposes, let's just go over some insights from Integrity Watch data. For example, in Malta, Integrity Watch data showed that almost 99% of political donations between 2016 and 2019 had undisclosed sources. So this represented more than 13 million euros in anonymous donations. And let's say, in this case, made the transparency gap very clear. No, so the public could not know who was financing political parties. No, in Lithuania, for example, following a 2021 lobbying reform that required both the lobbyists and the public officials with which they interacted to both report their interactions, Integrity Watch data found that actually lobbyists reported activities 2.5 times more often than the public officials they contacted. So that way it exposed, let's say, an important difference between the behavior in terms of reporting across both sides. No, in Hungary, Integrity Watch examined links between procurement and business ownership, and it identified 118 cases of business owners whose companies had won public contracts while they also held at least one public office, and many served or had previously served in the very same contracting authorities that hired their companies. No, so together these examples just serve to illustrate how political integrity risk indicators can make this type of concerns, let's say, more visible. Of course, producing this kind of evidence depends on being able to access and work with data from government sources. No, so in practice, availability, data quality, and format shape what civic monitoring tools like Integrity Watch can do. So from our experience, let's say we are able to identify 4 general scenarios. This is a very broad categorization. It's not meant to be comprehensive. It's just for, it allows us to make ourselves a mental picture of different cases that we can encounter. For example, in the best case scenario, no, information in a given country is public, it's openly accessible in machine readable formats, no. But in other cases, it may be that the information is public, but maybe not published in machine readable formats, or it's published in formats that require more preparation, let's say, and cleaning before analysis. In other countries, information may be disclosed, but only upon formal requests and depending on the type of information, no, with, of course, adds some sort of layer of not complexity, but an additional layer, no, in accessing the data and using it for regular monitoring. And of course, there are cases in which data are neither public nor disclosed, sometimes not even upon request. No, so these differences, let's say, have practical consequences. No, of course, as we know, difficult formats require more cleaning, more processing. The lack of consistent identifiers adds difficulty in linking different data sets, and changes in the structure or formats used by public institutions to publish their data can make it difficult, or let's say, or have an effect on the comparability across time, even if they continue to publish their data. Now, the Hungary example that we saw before, I think it serves to illustrate how evidence can, let's say, reveal a concrete integrity gap, which can be used to inform political integrity reform. So by connected procurement and company ownership data, Integrity Watch identified these relationships that would have been harder to see otherwise. And so we have identified the gaps. So how do we address them? Now, of course, there are many different ways in which such gaps can be addressed. This can include very obvious and very common ones, like, I don't know, legal broadening the legal definitions of conflicts of interest, requiring, of course, public officials to disclose relevant assets or company ownership or outside roles. But also we can think, for example, about giving oversight bodies the authority and, important, the capacity to cross-check relevant records before contracts are awarded. Of course, I'm sticking with the procurement-related example of Hungary. A practical example of this approach of trying to cross-check relevant information before contracts are awarded, I would like to mention Romania's Prevent system, for example, which actually very recently was upgraded actually to a second version, Prevent 2.0, that is more enhanced in terms of the technical features that it possesses. But what important, this system uses information from procurement procedures and other official records, of course, to carry out what they call preventive conflict of interest checks before contracts are signed. This is only one possible response. It just serves to illustrate how structured and linkable government data can be, of course, incorporated into public oversight. Now, thinking about reform, or another potential pathway to change, if we want to phrase it like that, has to do with improving the rules and the system that govern how political integrity data are produced and are made available for monitoring. Going back to the 2021 example of the reform in Lithuania, remember, requiring both lobbyists and public officials to report their activities. So this created this created a comparable records on both sides of this interaction that allowed Integrity Watch to identify this uneven reporting behavior that I mentioned earlier. So basically, better data can make implementation gaps more visible and can help show where better enforcement or reform may be needed, but also better rules can help generate sometimes the data needed to assess whether those rules are actually being followed. So I would argue that this provides a basis for advocacy on open data governance, advocating for political integrity data that are publicly available, regularly updated in machine-readable formats, consistently structured, and easier to connect across different sources. So basically, this can help create some sort of reinforcing cycle. So open and usable data can help identify weaknesses and inform legal, institutional, and transparency-related reforms. And some of those reforms can then require new information to be reported and published, creating better data for future monitoring. So data can therefore help show where changes is needed, while the reforms can improve the information available to assess whether that change is actually working. Of course, this is not automatic, or it doesn't happen on isolation. It still depends on the quality of the data, whether the reporting requirements are enforced, and whether institutions and civil society have the capacity to use the information to act upon the findings. And yeah, with this, I will conclude my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for such interesting presentation. We can continue because we don't have time. I would like to comment a lot of things that you mentioned, but well, let's follow let's go with Michele for the third presentation, and then we will have an space for questions. If you have questions, please save them, and then you can do them at the end of the session.
Great, thank you. I see a lot of overlap between our presentations, so that's really great. So thank you for having me here today to speak about this important topic in a room with others who are also really trying to make data more accessible. It's really great to meet you all. As Daiana mentioned, I'm Michele Coleman. I study the intersection of gender and corruption within health systems at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I will not repeat that next very long title there, but I have the privilege to serve as chair of this task force where I'll be speaking about the report today. Then I think just to, like everybody else, to give a bit of background information, as we all know on the call, corruption is not experienced as a neutral or universal phenomenon. It's influenced by structural inequalities, power asymmetries, and social norms. Women, men, and gender diverse individuals encounter corruption in different ways, and that's shaped by their access to resources or legal protections, even the roles within the household, the community, society, etc. I think we all might know that. This then makes, in many contexts, women may be more vulnerable to corruption due to the greater reliance on public services like healthcare, education, social protection sectors. And this is where we know informal payments or bribes, bureaucratic networks, coercive practices are quite common. And so then as a result, women may be more likely to experience these indirect effects of corruption as well as direct, but these are diminished access to public goods or services, lost economic opportunities, and then of course weakened trust in these institutions, which then further compound and reinforce existing gender inequalities. And so while women are often the victim of corrupt practices, they also play a vital role in combating them. As we know, studies show that increased female participation in political and public institutions is associated with stronger accountability mechanisms and lower levels of corruption, in particular in democratic contexts. So anti-corruption strategies are traditionally designed gender blind and measuring corruption in aggregate and then focusing exclusively on monetary transactions. And that other forms of corruption, like sexual corruption, can bypass traditional measurement systems entirely. In other words, our interventions may be built on incomplete data and misunderstandings of how corruption is occurring on the ground. Without the sex and gender disaggregated data, the experiences may remain statistically hidden. This is where the Gender and Data Task Force comes in. We sought to understand what data currently exists to measure gender and corruption's relationship in order to support researchers, practitioners, policymakers to better recommend interventions to prevent and combat the effects. As we know, gender-blind data sets can lead to ineffective policies, which then these policymakers are working blind without understanding who is affected, where, and how. So as this group knows, we need to standardize, expand, and open corruption data sets. So to support these efforts, this group then implemented a non-technical evidence review of publicly available data sets that intersect specifically with gender and corruption. And from this, we developed a report that I can share at the end, and then there's a forthcoming public database to house these data sets to hopefully increase their use. So this is our approach. We identified these publicly available primary and secondary data sets or databases that directly measure the intersection, or corruption data that aggregated their data by sex or gender, and or data that are proxy measures for understanding the relationship between corruption and gender. We searched online between February and April 2025 and used the standard search engines like Google, government websites, NGOs, and then AI was also used. And then we solicited feedback from individuals and organizations that know of or share or work directly with these databases on this topic. And then the scope of this is limited from 2000 and on in any geographical region. And then the data had to be publicly available or open or available upon request. And then just to note, this is not meant to be a scientifically systematic review, but instead just a comprehensive evidence review. So we may have missed some. And if you know of any, I would love to hear that so we can update the list in the database that's coming out. So this just describes the data sets. There were 18 that were included. 6 of them were globally focused, and the remainder are regional or country specific. 4 of them are those proxy measures that I mentioned, such as the OECD Gender Dashboard. The data focuses primarily on the public's perception or beliefs about corruption, second to their self-reported experience, and then objective data is the least available that we found. And then most of the data sets were publicly available directly online without requiring permissions. Only a few of them required paperwork or things like that, which is great. And the report and then upcoming database organizes the data by name, description of the set, the region country focus, whether it's objective, experiential, or perceptive, and then whether it's direct or proxy, so it's easier for you to search through. All right, so taking a look holistically at what we have available, these are the broad findings of what the data sets provide and then what is currently missing. So first, perception dominates. A lot of what we know about corruption and gender comes from perception surveys or people's opinions or self-reported experiences of corruption. These are very useful, but they also don't tell us how corruption actually unfolds, and few data sets capture administrative or enforcement data. And even when perception surveys are collect data by gender, it's rarely analyzed or published that way. It usually takes a couple layers to uncover and get to that data. Another finding is regional coverage is uneven. There's relatively strong coverage globally that provides broad insights into perceptions, experiences, and institutional safeguards. Africa and Europe were the best represented with the data sets we found, with tools like Afrobarometer, the Africa Integrity Indicators, and the European Quality of Government Index. In contrast, the Americas, Asia, and the MENA region almost rely entirely on the Global Corruption Barometer. And then also these smaller regional data sets usually required additional steps to access the data. Another finding is that the sectoral blind spots are quite large. So this is where, as we know, women are most exposed to corruption, like health, education, and social protections, and these are the ones that are least measured, at least publicly available. And then qualitative data is also lacking. Quantitative data dominates of what's available, but we're missing the qualitative insights that could contextualize these findings and illuminate the underlying mechanisms and lived experiences of those affected. As we know, qualitative data is much more resource intensive usually to collect and analyze, but this does leave gaps in understanding the nuanced ways that corruption manifests across different populations and sectors. Another finding is that gender is an afterthought. It often appears as a demographic variable and not as a central lens, with very few instruments explicitly capturing the gendered forms of corruption, like sexual corruption, or the ways corruption reinforces gender inequalities. And lastly, the relevant databases are not that well publicized, making them quite difficult to locate and access. And as I mentioned before, some of these took quite a bit of effort to actually get past the published findings to get to the raw data. So overall, the landscape looks broad, but it's shallow. We have the data, but it's fragmented, perception heavy, and missing the gender dimensions that actually drive inequality. So similar to my other presenters here, we have some priorities and there's a lot of recommendations that overlap with you all, which is great. We found 7 of them to make to help us prioritize how to make gender data or gendered corruption data more responsive. So the first is to strengthen gender disaggregated data collection. It seems quite obvious. Every corruption data set should publish sex disaggregated results just as a baseline. That should be the norm. It's not a special request. Integrating gender indicators into existing surveys is the fastest way to start. Number 2 is ensure safe reporting mechanisms. If we want to measure sexual corruption or coercive exchanges, we have to prioritize safety. Survivors need confidentiality and protection from retaliation if they report. Number 3 is promote mixed methods research. Quantitative surveys give us the what, but qualitatives give us the why and the how, and both are really essential to capture the lived experiences and context. 4 is invest in sector-specific research. We need more gender data from the frontline sectors like health and education, law enforcement, defense, about where power intersects most with gender inequality. 5 is to standardize methodologies. I heard this in the first presentation. Without these shared definitions and indicators, cross-country comparisons are really difficult. We need common standards so gendered corruption data can be aligned globally, perhaps with the other Integrity Watch data as well. Number 6 is raise awareness and political commitment. Gendered corruption isn't a niche topic, it's central to accountability, but we often get pushed that way. Political leaders and donors must prioritize it in governance agendas. And last, use existing data sets more effectively. We don't really need to reinvent everything. Many data sets already collect these variables, but they just haven't been analyzed or published through a gendered lens. And then to kind of ground all this in a concrete example from my own research, because these data gaps aren't abstract, They shape what we know, don't know, and affect our decision making. So specifically in Vietnam, I worked with the Provincial Governance and Public Administrative Performance Index, or PAPI, which is publicly available, nationally representative survey that's been collected annually since 2009. And roughly every year, it's between 15,000 and 20,000 surveys, so a big data set. It specifically captures citizen experience of governance and bribery, and crucially, it's open, which is why this research is possible. So I designed mixed methods study. And so for the quantitative, I was able to do predictive modeling with the PAPI data to identify gender differences and then other associated variables with the beliefs of them needing to bribe to receive healthcare and then the actual self-reported experiences of paying bribes at public health facilities. And then I have a qualitative component, which is in-depth interviews with healthcare users in Hanoi to understand the mechanisms behind the differences. And not to give too much away before it's fully published, but the regression results actually found other variables like ethnicity, education, and poverty to be significant predictors of the bribery outcomes, so the beliefs and experiences. But the interviews then actually established the mechanisms behind these associated variables, specifically that gender and gender inequality directly feeds into these poverty or education variables. So you needed both data sets to get this full picture. And this I see is a really good example of a model that we can use of open recurring data paired with qualitative data that provides depth and nuance and revealed something that would otherwise stay invisible. And it's why a direct example of why everyone in this room, all this matters for our work to make everything more gender responsive. And I want to thank you for your time and thank you importantly to everybody else who worked on this report, with one of them that's even in the room, Daiana. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, for your very interesting presentation, and thank you all speakers for your presentations. I would like now to open the floor to questions from our audience. So if anyone wants to make a question, a reflection, or if you have any comments, you can ask our speakers directly or put your questions in the chat. We don't have a lot of time, but I think that we have time for questions or comments.
Diogo, go ahead. I think I saw your hand.
Morning. Hi. I don't know if anyone else has questions. It's just a brief question. If there is some kind of data on how open data about corruption is somehow solving corruption. Or if my question makes sense, and if any of the presenters wanted to talk about this. Thank you.
I don't know if some of you want to.
I know that's not my niche area, but I will say that is probably something we would all love to solve and research and be able to understand, but to even begin to think about how to measure that would be very difficult. And I would love the open data charter to maybe speak on that if that's something they're tracking with KPIs or indicators and organizationally the impact that you have.
In the sense that it was good, no? My question is in the sense of use this as a development in the companies and in the culture and in the open data community.
Yes. We have another question. Mikita, if you want, Mikita.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? I just wanted to involve in previous question. So if I understand right, the question was about how open data can affect on anti-corruption activities and policy, right? Or it was about measurement of the data of results of it.
So how can we see these studies of the open data on corruption positively influencing the corruption itself? Like a step further.
I'm not
well,
sure
possible.
about studies, but I can just share some practical experience if you are interested, right? So
That would be
based
great.
on our experience, because we provide, I mentioned here in chat, we provide some instruments. So I represent Open Data Association. It's an NGO part of my activity. And the business part of my activity, we provided tools, international tools with more than 82 countries and 350 resources. And we provided for NGOs, and we have some experience and results from them. So for example, some NGOs are fully anti-corruption. Some NGOs are focusing on including some organization or people in sanction lists. Yes, because they can prove something. So there is a diverse part of different NGOs. And what we see from their results, first of all, it can be media publication with proofs based on their research. It can be results of their research which later turn on into public pressure on some peoples or companies based again on these materials. And the third part is when the NGOs have their own background with government and public institution across European Union or on national level, and they already have some reputation. They are trustworthy from the governmental parts. It can be law enforcement or some audit institution, whatever. And when they have this feedback from NGOs where they provide the results of their research, for example, including ultimate beneficial ownership structure or research on the subject of sanctioned entities involved into some chains. So it can turn into results such as pressure, such as furthermore institutional decision based on this information. So I'm not sure about scientific research based about quantitative measurement, but from practical point of view, it can have a result when you have research and proofs of your research. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contributions, Mikita. We have another question in the chat from Ravi. And he say that if you had to choose one practical reform that governments should implement in the next 12 months to make open data genuinely actionable, not just available, what would it be, and how would you measure its success from a citizen's perspective? Thank you, Ravi, for the question. A very interesting one. I don't know if some of you want to jump in.
Well, maybe I can just.
Please do.
So I can start, Roberto. I think probably just going back to some of the frameworks I was presenting earlier and caveating that obviously this is just about it was just about the beneficial ownership data specifically, but I think these includes principles that are applicable to any sort of data, really going back to this to this idea of understanding usability. I think is directly related to your point about data being generally actionable. If you do want that, you need to understand what it doesn't mean the same thing for everyone, right? What we've seen in our context of use of beneficial ownership data is, I don't know, for example, you might have some users who are dealing with very high volumes of data, who are trying to understand, analyze trends to prevent risks or inform their risk assessment policies, as Roberto was, mentioning about, for example, trying to connect beneficial ownership data and public procurement data to understand some of the risks that are tending to come up. Well, to do that, you would probably need some technical solutions like APIs and we were talking about data fragmentation, interoperability. All of this kind of solutions would be directly applicable if you do want to put in place systems that can help government users in this context to prevent building systems where they can detect red flags automatically. That might be very different from an investigator that is focusing on like maybe one specific case, but actually still needs, it's not enough as well to just make a request one-off on one company, because usually the timeliness of response to requests can be very tricky. And then we know that you start with one company or individuals and you tend to pull the threads and going from one thing to another. And you might not even know where you're going from, at the moment where you start. So you need ways to flexibly explore a data set, and that might not necessarily require you to ingest a lot of, high volumes of data, but it's still what it means to be actionable for those people. So I would really go back to this notion of user research and usability to be at the center of any data related initiative.
Thank you, Juliet. And actually, you more or less address more or less what I wanted to say. But also going back a little bit to Diogo's questions. No, so yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of any, let's say, yeah, exactly. Academic research, this quantitative research study making this connection, as also very well Nikita mentioned. No, I mean, in the way that it's comprehensive, that because there will always be many, let's say, unobservables, let's say, no, so that we will rely on a lot of proxies in order to, let's say, fill in the gaps and try to somehow measure an observed phenomenon, no, so that difficults, let's say, the construction of a purely quantitative methodology, no, so and that. So we rely, let's say, or not rely, we have some case studies that are, let's say, more examples, let's say, that are useful, for example, in public in using integrity watch data. And also there have been some instances in which data that was found or insights that were found through the platforms led to some, let's say, more actual practical results. For example, in Latvia, there was a case in which, thanks to integrity watch data, some a relationship between a major and a company that he was related to was discovered, and there was a contract, and it led to eventually, so it got media attention, and it led, let's say, to the canceling of these contracts. But it's just a case study, and also we cannot have this sort of comprehensive thing, no. And going to Ravi's question, no, yeah, and I think Juliet, you already basically you answered it perfectly. No, so it's really hard to have this sort of multi-purpose approach, let's say, to it depends very much on the data, on the type of data, and but also what I was mentioning in my intervention. No, so things doesn't happen in isolation. No, it depends also on what are the institutional, the governance in the specific country, and so on. No, so in terms, for example, and there are always gray areas. In terms, for example, beneficial ownership data, what you mentioned, Juliet. No, so yeah, so we can automatically think, yeah, just make all the data available for everyone. But then, of course, there are some individual data protection considerations that we need to take into account. No, and then finally, talking about, let's say, the idea of linking different data sources and data sets. No, so it's important also that we need to think, let's say, I don't want to say out of the box because it's not really that, but we need to think in different ways. It's not just linking different data sets, but also trying to apply this behavior to what we observe that may be happening in reality. So have more or less a clear question that we want to answer in mind. So, for example, let's take the example of asset and incomes declaration. No, so many countries have their own data sets, their own, let's say, records on assets and income declaration of public officials. No, but in reality, it can occur and does occur a lot. No, that of course individuals can have assets across borders, can have assets in different countries. No, so let's say an approach there to try to make the data more, let's say, work or be more usable is to try to somehow connect different countries' data sets and try to identify the individual across data sets and assign a unique identifier so we can have these more common standardized data sets that goes across borders, in which we can follow the individual across different frameworks. No, so that would be also a type of approach. But yeah, exactly. Concluding, but that I could not think, at least in a multi-purpose, let's say, approach, no, that we can follow. No, thank you.
Mindful of time, but also mindful because, Michele, you kind of pointed to the ODC in relation to Diogo's question. We unfortunately do not work specifically in monitoring and measurement, but it is something that we want to be a part of, that we want to be a part of the life cycle of our projects, but we don't have examples either, unfortunately. But we agree with everyone that it's absolutely important, and it's something that we can all work on together. I think everyone in the room is working on like different either parts of the kind of opening up data and the life cycle of like data governance. So yeah, I didn't want that to go kind of unanswered. But yes, Daiana.
Yeah, thank you for all your questions and comments. It's very interesting to discuss these topics, and we are all very passionate about that. We ran out of time, so I would like to thank you all for participating, and also thank you to our three speakers. I also would like to mention that these conversations are going to continue, because every month from the implementation working group, we organize sessions on different topics. So the next session will take place in July, and it will focus on data governance. So we would like to welcome all of you to continue engage with these topics. And thank you very much for your participation.
Yes, and we can continue in the Google group as well if there are, if anyone finds anything or would like to share further. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for all your time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day, all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Daiana. And Diogo.